when you're framing your pitch, it's the equivalent of like an establishing shot in a film. Any filmmaker or producer that's trying to make a movie or a TV show, there's usually an establishing shot, which just puts you in the right mindset for what's going to happen. And this is the same thing when you're giving a pitch. Like, you want to get somebody in the right mindset very early on. And so those first few sentences or those first few slides really matter a lot. And when framing your pitch, there are different ways to help an investor appreciate what you're doing. First of all, it has to be interesting and attention grabbing. If you come in with low energy and you have an idea that's super arcane, or you're speaking about something that is a boring topic, like, why are they going to give you the time of day? Why should they care? You need to quickly capture attention.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Zack Schildhorn, an investing partner at venture firm Lux Capital. He played multiple key roles that helped the firm scale from less than $100 million to more than $4 billion in assets under management. After witnessing thousands of pitches, he saw that even the most disruptive startups often struggle to develop effective narratives. Having worked closely with leading technology companies as an investor and a board member, he brings a unique ability to connect with key stakeholders and distill complex ideas into engaging and relatable presentations. In order to help founders beyond Lux, he launched a firm called Series Z to help a select group of tech companies and funds bring their vision to life. Zack also recently partnered with Khosla Ventures to help founders there as well. Zack kindly agreed to share some of the lessons learned from his experience teaching the art of storytelling to founders and VCs, and I think you will benefit tremendously from this episode. Zack, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today. I was doing some research in preparation for this conversation and was super impressed by how you help translate complex technological concepts into narratives that resonate deeply with investors. I would love to explore your approach to storytelling and understand how you help founders craft compelling messages.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for reaching out.
Yeah. So a broad theme for our conversation is about why brilliant people with great ideas and powerful technologies fail to pitch their startup ideas well. At least in this podcast sense, I deal with a lot of PhDs and postdocs, scientists and engineers trying to spin their research into startups. And in a world where everyone has short attention spans, having a narrative that can grab someone's attention is very hard, but also possible. And I believe like coaches like you have done a successful job and you've helped so many founders and investors alike. So let's talk about this art of storytelling today.
Well, you asked why so many people struggle, and I wish I had a succinct answer for you. This question drove me insane because here I was as a venture capitalist who would sit in rooms all days with very intelligent, ambitious people who could not make an effective connection with me as an investor. And I was constantly asking myself, like, why is this so hard? Like, what is so challenging about communicating ideas that leaves these very smart people who know there's a lot at stake in this meeting unable to deliver time and time and time again? And this kind of set me off on my own storytelling journey, both within my firm and ultimately to starting my own company called Series Z, which is what I focus on today and what I do. But yeah, it was this eternal question is, why do stories matter? And also, why do so many people struggle with telling them?
What comes up on the top? Like one or two reasons, like you've been doing this for a while. Why are they struggling? I have my hypothesis. I'll go after you. But I want to hear your thoughts.
I've thought about this a lot, and I'm talking about it from the standpoint specifically of startup founders who are trying to connect with investors. I think many of the lessons apply more broadly to storytelling in general and life and capturing attention, but my focus is very specifically on this narrow domain. And within this domain, I feel that most founders are in a very challenged position. First of all, I have the most respect for people who make the decision to take on so much risk with so much uncertainty ahead to go try to bring a new idea into the world. It's got to be one of the hardest jobs on the planet because there are no right answers. There is very little support, and you are on your own. And with the team you build and the resources you gather to go out into the world and try to make something happen. And I just have such admiration for that. But I also think it presents a challenge for people because to tell a good story, particularly to an investor, I think it requires the synthesis of many different skill sets. First of all, it requires you to be fundamentally extremely knowledgeable about not just the technology you're developing, but the industry that you are operating in or intend to operate in. And oftentimes people are so focused in the weeds on their technology that they lose sight of that bigger picture. There's an element of creativity that's required and just iterating and spending time to test different ways to communicate your ideas, both verbally and visually, to see what sticks. And you've got 8 million other things going on. You don't have time to sit there and write out 15 different versions of how you're going to introduce your idea, but it's really important. And some people, I think, struggle visually to make things look simple and appealing or to communicate visually. Some people are better verbal communicators. Some people are better visual communicators. I think you need to be able to do both to effectively have a pitch and put together a good pitch deck. There's the time requirement of it just takes time. You cannot have an effective pitch overnight. It takes repetition, just like any skill. Practice, repetition, iteration, and feedback. And that means you got to be out there pitching all of the time and responding to what's working and what's not. And most entrepreneurs don't have the time. They're running companies, they're hiring people, they're trying to fundraise, they're trying to pay the next bill, they're managing 800 internal systems. They have everything on their shoulders. So time is very scarce. And then the final thing, which arguably might be the most important and the least accessible for many founders, is an appreciation of how their counterparty, who is an investor, actually thinks. Most entrepreneurs have not spent time sitting in venture capital offices and hearing pitch meetings from the side of an investor. They haven't heard how deliberations are done or how decisions are made. They don't even necessarily fully understand all of the various incentives of a venture firm or partnership. And without being armed with that knowledge, you are almost walking blind into any meeting with a VC, let alone knowing that specific investor or their history or their firm's history. And so I think to develop a really effective pitch, you need some combination of all of these different things. And it's very difficult for one person to embody all of that while also running a company. So again, I have great empathy because I do think it's something that's hard, but it's obviously possible because there are people who are really good at it. So the question I have been trying to address, and I try to work with my companies and clients on, is how do we close that gap between what is possible and what could be great and what is today?
Closing the gap between what a technology could be in the future compared to the status today is probably a nice segue to talk about the importance of painting a good vision for the future. How should one approach the subject?
I think this comes back to something that's super fundamental in any kind of storytelling, which is you have to make it matter for your audience. You have to attract their interest, appeal to their interest. I think it's a great Ben Franklin quote, would you appeal to interest, not reason, or something along those lines. Figure out somebody's incentives. And so often, founders, particularly technical founders, are very focused on the what of what they're doing, the technology itself, how it works, and not the why they're doing it. And an investor particularly a venture capital investor, is incentivized to take stakes in companies that have the potential to be absolutely enormous. And so for them, they need to understand why they should care very early on in your story or discussion. And investors are not buying the product that you're making. They're not buying the technology you're developing. They're not even buying the business that you're building. They're buying equity in your company. And they hope to sell those shares at a future date for a much higher price. So the ultimate question that an investor is trying to answer is, why do I think this company, these shares in this company, are going to be worth much more in the future? And that requires you to sell that future vision early on. What could this become if you are really successful? Why does this matter in the context of the industry that you're operating in, how the world is changing? What are you going to enable in the world? What change will happen in a really big way if you're really successful? And that is often wholly ignored or a side conversation, whereas I think it's so foundational to any story. Is, why should an investor care? Why is this going to be big? What is your vision? What could that future look like?
Selling that vision is so important. I think if a founder does it right, it actually conveys the confidence a founder has in our startup, and also gives an opportunity for the founder to open up investors' minds, which they might not have otherwise. Do you have any frameworks that you recommend to founders as they develop their narratives?
Well, every pitch is different and every company is different and every idea is different. And that's what's exciting about it, because there's no single answer. And it depends, unfortunately, it depends on what people's common conceptions are, whether your audience has any education on the topic or not. All of those things matter. But when developing a pitch and really framing it, we were talking about this earlier. I asked you kind of what you learned as a storyteller, having built a podcast, and you said the introduction matters so much. If you can't hook people pretty early on, then they're not going to pay attention. And I agree very strongly with that. And recently gave a talk, actually all titled Framing Your Pitch. It actually just is published on YouTube, so you can find it online pretty easily. But first of all, it anchors to this idea that when you're framing your pitch, it's the equivalent of like an establishing shot in a film. Any filmmaker or producer that's trying to make a movie or a TV show, there's usually an establishing shot, which just puts you in the right mindset for what's going to happen. And this is the same thing when you're giving a pitch. Like, you want to get somebody in the right mindset very early on. And so those first few sentences or those first few slides really matter a lot. And when framing your pitch, there are different ways to help an investor appreciate what you're doing. First of all, it has to be interesting and attention grabbing. If you come in with low energy and you have an idea that's super arcane, or you're speaking about something that is a boring topic, like, why are they going to give you the time of day? Why should they care? You need to quickly capture attention. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. But when I think about creating value for investors and framing the idea of value for investors, there's kind of a framework I've come up with called the 6 Ps. And when investors assessing you, right, they're assessing really 2 things, which is your company or your idea itself, like the merits of the idea, but also you as the entrepreneur. Is this somebody that I think I can back? Are they going to have what it takes? And so in teasing those 2 things apart, I think there are a few ideas from each of those columns to latch onto. So first of all, when assessing you as a founder, are you passionate? Just back to what we were speaking about, is this someone that really feels like they're on a mission to solve this problem? Do they have pedigree? Did they come from an incredible research lab? Did they come out of a reputable startup? Most investors definitely are biased by pedigree. I mean, it's why a lot of companies will go out and raise money just because they came out of a SpaceX or a Google. Those things matter. And then to that point about having a chip on your shoulder, like, do I think this person has grit and perseverance? Is this the kind of founder that I think is going to be able to weather tough storms? And I have stories to talk about for each of these ideas, but just at the high level. So that's judging you, passion, pedigree, perseverance. And then for your idea, it's judging precedent, perspective, and performance. So perspective is usually one that most early stage companies can bring to the table, which is they have a unique view of the world. They have a unique and interesting perspective that perhaps challenges that investor's mental model of how the world works. That's a way to capture somebody's attention, to have a unique perspective, to demonstrate precedent. So this idea that there's great value to be created in what you are building because something like this has happened before. And again, I'm happy to go into examples of each of these. And then the final one being performance, which is if you have some measure of performance in your technology or your business that you can demonstrate, that is something that can help somebody appreciate something special is happening here.
Yeah, I think that's a nice framework. The perspective stands out for me a lot because it plugs into that investor mindset. How should a founder evaluate the mindset of an investor and changing that perspective? Like, do you have any examples of founders that have done a good job?
Yeah, I was just telling a story earlier today about a company that I was introduced to that was working in the grocery space. So they were developing a smart grocery cart that had all sorts of computer vision sensors to help enable grocery stores to do automatic checkout. And one of the problems they had was that most investors looked at them as just a piece of hardware. And when you talk to them and really understood their customer set, this really wasn't about the hardware for their customers. It was they're selling into grocery. Grocery is a low margin industry, yet 90-something% of all grocery sales still happen offline. So this is an industry that has not been digitally instrumented yet and has one of the scariest competitors in the world, Amazon, suddenly on their turf, building out their own grocery stores, buying Whole Foods and delivering groceries, and they're scared. They know they need to change, but the friction to change seems very high and the expertise very outside of their domain. And so what Caper was, this company is called Caper, and I had led the investment in this company while I was at my prior firm, my investment firm. What Caper was offering their customers was a full digital transformation solution. So the easiest way to effectively bring your grocery store into the digital age with the least amount of friction. You didn't have to commit to some huge whole store retrofit where you're putting sensors on every shelf and every 6 feet on the ceiling. Just buy a few of these grocery carts. And what these offer is a really incredible experience for shoppers where they don't have to wait in lines. They can get information about products right on their screen. They can be served interesting and relevant pieces of information. But from a store standpoint, all of a sudden, they now have this incredible new tool at their disposal where they can see what's happening in their stores in real time, over time, like build out advertising capabilities, inventory management capabilities, quality control, all into this single piece of hardware. And so they flipped the script for investors by helping them really early on appreciate that this is not about selling smart grocery carts. This is about transforming an industry to the modern era. Now, ultimately, Caper got acquired by Instacart, which is pretty perfect acquire. I wish they kind of called it the Instacart. I think it's still called the Caper Cart, but it should be called the Instacart. But for them, very strategic for a lot of reasons. I mean, they're really focused on building their advertising business and now can offer a whole in-store advertising platform. It creates a lot of lock-in with the physical grocers, which would make it difficult to switch to another competitor. And then over time, I think they might build really cool capabilities like scan your QR code on the cart as an Instacart shopper, and it'll map out the whole route for you in store automatically and make picking much more efficient and order fulfillment much more efficient. But yeah, that was an idea of sharing a unique perspective. And it's one that really helped people see right away that this was so much bigger than maybe they had in their minds.
That's a fascinating story. 8 to 10 years ago, everything was about IoT and putting a bunch of cameras all over the store. And I think this is a nice improvement, right? Just taking everything to the cart. Thank you for sharing that story. I think going back to our initial conversation about storytelling, like one thing that stands out is how do you make somebody care for the problem that you're working on, especially the investors? Any advice on that? Because a lot of my friends are in the biotech space. A lot of them are curing some disease. And after an investor listens to 100 or 1,000, don't they become not so sensitive to emotions that come out of like, oh, cancer. Yes, I know that it. How do you grab somebody's attention if you're trying to do something in that space?
Yeah, I mean, number one is appealing to emotion. Most people are emotional decision makers, and they make decisions in their gut and rationalize in their head. And for investors, honestly, the emotions that are often most effective are greed and fear. And maybe this is true for a lot of people, but it's the desire to make a lot of money. I mean, that's their whole job, and to not miss out on the next great opportunity. And so I've been in meetings where you see these emotions at play, and it's quite amazing how that can influence a decision process where in many cases all logic and rational thought goes out the window. And that's how we get these whole bubble-like environments. It's kind of the story of innovation in human history. But yeah, you have to be able to appeal to emotions. And I think the two most powerful ones are greed and fear. Fear is tough because unless you are in the midst of a very competitive round dynamic where there are a lot of investors trying to put money into your company, then it's hard to artificially create a real sense of fear of missing out. Another flip side of that is like if you're in a very popular domain, sometimes you get like AI, which is like topic du jour right now. I think now increasingly so, there's a lot more skepticism just because every company is an AI company. But early on, when maybe there weren't as many players available, it felt like investors had a fear of missing out on this wave, and so would be much more likely to pay attention to a company that was doing something in AI. But yeah, on the greed side, this goes back to this point about like selling the vision. They have to believe that there's an opportunity for them to make a lot of money in this company because it could achieve something important.
Stories that stand out in your experience that you've seen where investors made a decision based on that fear or greed?
Yeah, I mean, on the greed side, like let me think back to a few examples that could really stand out. All the time in this industry, I think bad decisions get made often when it's a fearful decision. And there are probably many examples of investors, particularly later stage investors in recent history, making really big, crazy bets at crazy prices on companies that didn't really deserve it. And in the moment, everything was high flying and people felt like they needed to allocate dollars or they were going to miss out. And a lot of money got invested in a lot of companies at some crazy prices. And those are looking like really bad decisions right now. There's a lot of stories that you could read about companies like WeWork and others where you can really see this out over the trajectory of a company's life cycle. And it's obviously not good for investors and ultimately not good for the companies either in many cases. I think you're seeing this right now a little bit with OpenAI. So OpenAI has managed to raise an extraordinary amount of money at extraordinary prices with a very unusual kind of company structure, and also strike these quite unprecedented deals with some of the biggest technology companies on the planet, like Microsoft and Apple, which is really quite unheard of. And I think it's almost all to do with these two emotions. For big companies, it's the fear of missing out on this next big wave of technology that is promoted to change absolutely everything. And if they're not partnering with the leader in the space, they may fall behind. So I think that probably motivates some of the behavior you're seeing on the corporate side. And then on the investor side, the greed is palpable. I mean, it's like everybody's talking about it. There's the social proof. People want to be a part of this, and you can't get into the company. There's probably like anybody's trying to buy any scrap of secondary shares they can because they just believe this is the anointed one. And that's decisions getting made out of those two core emotions, fear and greed, because there's no way that business is nearly big enough yet to come close to justifying its current valuation.
Yeah. I think you mentioned emotions, and I think that's a nice segue to talk about actually framing a pitch. And I heard you mention about starting with words and not a slide because it just takes emotions into a different direction. Maybe you can give a small lesson of why it is important to start with words than a slide?
Well, first of all, not every meeting you're going to be in is going to be a meeting where you can whip up your slide deck and start showing things on the screen. So I think to be dependent upon slides is a negative to begin with. But even beyond that, ideas aren't formed on pitch deck slides. Ideas are formed in your head, and ideas are ultimately usually best expressed as language. It's how most people communicate face to face, is by talking to each other. And so you need to be able to very effectively get in front of someone, whether they're an investor or a potential hire or a partner, and quickly communicate to them why what you're working on is exciting and they should care about it. And so often when I'm working with teams, and advice I commonly give is, when you're working on developing your pitch, it's important to start with words and not slides. The slides are secondary to the ideas. They reinforce those ideas, those words that you're going to come up with, and they can sometimes help amplify them or show something that's hard to explain verbally. But ultimately, you have to be able to convince somebody on the merit of the idea with just your words. And so that's why often I say start with words. And when developing a pitch, I usually say start even with bullets. What are the 10 key ideas that you need to get across? I recently had a group of people go through an exercise, and it's actually quite a hard exercise to do, which is take 5, 10, 15 minutes, and in 5 bullet points or less, try to communicate why somebody should care about what you're working on. And that's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, I like that. You mentioned about words. I'm a big fan of memos, writing memos. Jeff Bezos famously talks about it. All the venture capitalists seem to be writing memos to each other after an investment decision. I bring that up because most often investors ask you to send a deck. Where do you put the words in there? Like if you're standing in them.
Well, first of all, I think people don't appreciate that there are no rules in this industry. There's just customs. And so if you feel like your idea is very well expressed through a 2-page or 3-page memo, by all means, send the memo. I think decks are easy because they're really fast to flip through, and investors are not super patient and don't want to sit down and read a novel. And so they'll quickly skim through a deck. And in that case, you want to make sure that that deck captures their attention quickly and the ideas come across clearly, or they will judge you negatively for it. But there's no reason you can't start with a few paragraphs or have kind of a handout deck that is half visuals, half words. I've seen some companies do this very effectively, where kind of they communicate many of their key ideas in that way, where the deck is very much like a combination of actual written story and visuals to support it.
There are no rules. I think that's something that people forget, and they stick to that. You need to send a deck, otherwise they won't look at your application. I forget about that too. And you can make your own rules in the startup world. The next point I wanted to talk about was about technical explanation. Any suggestion on how to explain complex technology or processes in an accessible manner on a deck? People tend to go dive into data. That would not be the best way to do that. Any recommendations or examples of how people have done this?
Let me tell a story here, because I think that'll help bring it to life. As technologists, I completely understand why you want to be very precise and get very technical very quickly on what you're building. There are ways to convey ideas that are probably more effective without doing a disservice to kind of the authenticity of what you're trying to communicate. And let me give an example. So I, several years ago, worked with a publicly traded biotech company called VTV Therapeutics. And this is developing a new drug for type 1 diabetes. And it's a disease that hasn't received a lot of attention, particularly relative to type 2 diabetes. Very promising compound. And you can talk a lot about the compound and what it does and why it's special, its mechanism of action, all of the data. And that is important. And that is how the company was previously communicating their story. It was very much right away about this new drug that basically allows the liver to store glucokinase in people who can't do that. And unless you are someone who has already studied this space or cares deeply about type 1 diabetes, either because you are a type 1 diabetic or have somebody in your family or a connection that makes you care about this topic, it's not something that stands out to people. And there's so many other companies that tell stories of their compounds and the mechanism of action of that compound and what disease it targets and all of those things. So how do you make this story stand out? And I remember very clearly talking to a patient that I got connected to, someone who had type 1 diabetes, was also an advocate for patients with this disease. And they had this incredible analogy, which was living with type 1 diabetes is like driving too fast on a really dangerous road. And they used the analogy of the Pacific Coast Highway. I don't know if you've ever driven that road, but it's super windy. Yeah. And on one end is like literally a cliff that you can fall off into the ocean. And the other is a rock wall. And the shoulders aren't very wide. It's very windy. And when you have type 1 diabetes, you don't really produce insulin. And so you can't control your blood sugar naturally. And so you have to do that artificially through the use of insulin. And if you don't have insulin, your blood sugar rises too high, which has all these long-term consequences. But if you use too much insulin, and this is what most people who have never had diabetes don't appreciate, if you use too much insulin, you can get what's called hypoglycemia. And the consequences of that are far more acute. That is, you black out and wake up in a hospital or potentially die. Anybody who's had a hypoglycemic episode is terrified of it, and rightly so. And so what ends up happening for patients with type 1 diabetes is they underdose insulin because they want to avoid that situation, which long-term, they're not effectively managing the diabetes to begin with, which is high blood sugar, right? Not enough insulin. And so he uses a beautiful analogy of the road of, you're supposed to stay in your lane. But if you're driving on the side that's close to the cliff, you're probably going to want to hug the middle line or even maybe drive halfway into the oncoming traffic lane. And that's obviously not safe, but it feels safer than driving close to the edge. And I thought it was such a beautiful analogy. And that's actually how we opened the pitch, which is living with type 1 diabetes is like driving too fast on a dangerous road. And we use that analogy to help people understand why the drug they're developing, which allows you to better modulate those swings naturally. And it's the first drug to be able to do that by restoring some of the body's natural capabilities to store sugar and then release over time. The ability to do that, why that's so powerful. And in leading with that story and that analogy, it helped you explain the technology in a way that I think made so much more sense to so many more people who were not in this domain.
That's a great analogy. And
there's another great analogy. There's another example from biotech, and there's a lot in biotech because it's so complex and so confusing. Another company I work with that has this amazing technology out of Jennifer Doudna's lab. I think you actually might know this founder. Jennifer Doudna's the CRISPR discoverer, and he came up during his PhD thesis, with this incredible technology to make it really easy to conjugate complex biological molecules. And most people who aren't in biotech or have a biology background don't know what that means or why that's important. And he talks about this story of when he was a kid, he just loved building with Legos. And he just loved how you could like put things together to make almost anything you could imagine. And the simplicity and elegance of that system to build wildly complex creations from the most simple of building blocks. And that's why he ultimately became a chemist. And when he was a chemist, he got really interested in biology and decided he really wanted to become a biochemist. And he went from this world of chemistry where things are so structured and ordered and formulaic and predictable to this world of biochemistry where it just felt like a totally different world. And he wanted to be able to do things that he could do in chemistry, like put together a piece of RNA and an antibody. And you can't do that easily in biology. And so he had the gumption to ask why not, and went out to discover this enzyme that let you put things together. And that way of explaining it, that analogy and that personal story, we haven't really talked too much about incorporating story, but that personal story and that way of explaining it, that analogy, just helps the technology make sense for somebody in a way that it might not have had you just jumped right into it.
Yeah, Marco Lobo is a good friend. I've known him for a while since he started the company. Thanks for sharing that anecdote as well. Speaking of analogies, it reminds me of something else I came across in one of your presentations about reframing, about how this company reframed nuclear energy by asking the investors to imagine if nuclear fission was discovered last week, it would be hailed as a miracle. I think it's such a creative way of framing or reframing a problem, especially something that people are scared of.
And look, there's so much nuance in all of this, but one thing that I think is really important is to address known skepticisms very early in any pitch or story. So if you know that ultimately you get the same questions or people have the same assumptions about a topic, you have to be able to really early on address that, or the whole time, that's all they're going to be thinking about.
Yeah.
If your audience has some assumption, that they're going to be waiting to ask that question or ignoring half of what you're saying because they don't believe it, because they have some assumption about what you're doing. So if you know what some of those assumptions are, you have to be able to address them really early on in the pitch. And this was one example where I was working with a nuclear energy company, and nuclear is amazing. For those people who don't appreciate, it's the
big fan of it. Yeah.
Cleanest, safest, probably most scalable form of baseload electricity that we have today. Solar has gotten incredibly affordable, but is obviously variable with sunlight, which is a problem because we like to use electricity 24/7 and our storage systems aren't quite up to par yet. So nuclear, incredible, but just hasn't received much investment since the build out of the industry, at least not in the US. China is building out quite a few reactors, but represents 20% of our baseload clean energy, and just totally ignored by investors. And there are very salient assumptions about nuclear in people's minds, which are, what do you do with the waste? And is this safe? Probably not in that order. Is this safe? And then what do you do with the waste? And you kind of have to get people to step back and reappreciate how incredible this technology is, that it's almost unfathomable to me that it was discovered and invented when it was in the late 30s and early 40s, even pre the computer era. This technology is astounding. The fact that you can turn something that's effectively dirt, or rocks into this almost unlimited amount of clean energy with a very tiny amount of waste, and do it safely and reliably and repeatably. And so the framing for that is very simple, because going in, so many investors had skepticism or assumptions about nuclear, and just let's back up a second and imagine that nuclear fission did not exist. Forget all of the history and context for a second. And we're in the same society we're in right now, huge environmental crisis, need to find scalable forms of huge amounts of power to power our growing society and its growing demands. And all of a sudden, somebody discovers a way to take abundant materials and combine and operate them in a way where you can convert those materials directly into energy at an unbelievable scale. Literally E equals mc squared times the speed of light squared, mass times the speed of light squared. You obviously don't get quite that much out, but it's insane. Yeah. And in doing so, it would be on the cover of every major newspaper magazine in the world. People would be tweeting about it like crazy. There'd be celebrations in society. It would be topic du jour for every nation. Everybody would be scrambling to kind of have a piece of this and build it out and be the first. And yet here we are where it's this incredible thing and nobody even talks about it. And kind of opening like that and just having somebody appreciate how incredible it is for a second maybe makes them more open-minded to, for a moment, ignore or hold aside some of their skepticism.
It is a brilliant way to reframe a problem and address apprehensions. I'm sure a lot of thought went into this framing in that way. It also sounds like a very useful exercise to acknowledge obvious problems early on, because you bring up a very important point about how investors, if they notice it, might not be paying attention to your presentation, and you lose a great opportunity to shape an investor's thought process by not addressing those obvious challenges early on. Well, a related subject is how founders tend to get defensive when certain topics are raised. Do you have any thoughts on controlling emotions and not getting defensive?
Yeah. I think it's important to appreciate that everybody's just doing their own job and to not be offended if somebody doesn't understand you effectively or somebody has a different idea than you do. Now, I think a lot of people, particularly very technical people who come through these programs, pride themselves on their unique knowledge of the world, like they've mastered a domain, but have to remember that 99.999% of other people have a totally different life experience and different point of view. And those may not be totally aligned. So it's kind of incumbent upon you to figure out a way to get your ideas across in a way where people aren't asking questions that you think are stupid or offensive, or appreciate that maybe treating a question as an opportunity to learn, why are they asking that question? Not being offended by the question. So if somebody keeps asking, what are you going to do about X? And you're like, X has nothing to do with what I'm telling you about. Well, they obviously think it does. So like, what are you doing wrong in how you're communicating your idea? Or what are you missing in the bigger picture that is important to be educated about so you can appropriately steer off that question or have a very clear answer to it? But I think it's easy to get frustrated, but I don't think there's any point in getting offended unless someone's just a complete jerk, in which case you can feel bad for them because they're obviously not a content person and go on with your life.
I completely agree with that. There is no point of getting frustrated or defensive. Instead, one can use that as an opportunity to understand how an investor thinks about a certain problem. Maybe you'll come up with a better solution, actually. Let's pivot slightly to an equally crucial aspect of storytelling, the art of delivery. While crafting a compelling narrative is essential, its impact ultimately hinges on how it is conveyed. I'm curious about your insights on honing this skill. Could you share your perspective on effective strategies for practicing and refining one's delivery?
So we didn't get much into my background, but I spent a very long time at a venture firm called Lux Capital that invests in a lot of frontier tech domains. I was there for 15 years and joined when the firm was quite young and left when we were fairly well established. An incredible journey. And I remember one thing that struck me about Lux's success in building a brand and fundraising from our own investors, our limited partners, was one of our firm's co-founders, Josh Wolf, incredible communicator and storyteller. I highly recommend you follow him on Twitter. He's very active online. But he is always pitching internally, externally. It's just a constant practice. And I mean, just if you want to get good at anything, if you want to get good at martial arts or you want to get good at sports, like you just do it all the time. You have to, or music. You just have to keep doing it and practicing and trying new things. And it's amazing because we would almost make fun of him internally because you kind of knew what he was going to say because you'd heard it so many times. But that's because he was always practicing, and he's an incredible communicator and incredible at telling the Lux story as a result, and just something he loves to do. And so I don't think there's like a discipline of like you should practice 10 minutes a day or you should find these 10 people to try to practice with. No, it's you're constantly testing these ideas. When you're in line in the grocery store and turn around and meet somebody behind you and strike up a conversation, they ask you what you do. That's your chance to really quickly see if you can connect with somebody who you don't even know their background and really quickly convey effectively like the excitement around what you're doing and have them actually understand it at some capacity as opposed to just nod their head and look blankly in your direction.
Zack, I understand that the art of storytelling is not so easy, but I'm curious to know if there are any cases that were really hard for you to crack.
Yeah, people have very different opinions on this. And I honestly think, again, it's secondary because you could have a whole pitch where you never even use slides. It's a phone call or a happenstance meeting where you spend 5 minutes with somebody and they like you. So I think the first thing is making sure that you have a way to connect with people, no matter what. And even though this whole thing has been about storytelling, we haven't even really talked that much about storytelling itself. We've been talking more about like narrative frameworks and everything, but story is really a great way to do that. Like tell a story about yourself. What's your story? How did you get to where you are today in a succinct and entertaining way? Or is there something that happened to you along your journey that landed you in the place you're in now by intention or not? A lot of startups get founded that way where something happened that drove to a new idea that sparked the basis for a really big company.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of stories, are there any transformative stories that happened for a founder who came to you when they were raw when they first came to you, and that how that story evolved? Anything that stands out?
Yeah, I mean, that story of Caper was one that was just so tangible to change because they were talking a lot about the cart itself, its technical capabilities, how much it costs, how long it would take to manufacture, how scalable it was. And these were all legitimate questions that investors would have, but ultimately secondary to helping people appreciate the big idea, which is if this company is successful, it could play a role in really transforming and digitizing an entire industry. And when we made that change, and by the way, that wasn't the only change. Like, that was the opening of the pitch. We made it clear that grocery hasn't changed in 100 years. And we used a really clever visual anchor to do that, which is basically like a picture of someone grocery shopping in like 1920 something and side by side with a picture of someone grocery shopping today. And it looks pretty much identical, right? Like the experience hasn't changed very much. And he told a personal story, the founder who was pitching, about his background and how he's been an entrepreneur since he was a kid, started his first business at a very young age, and has just always been driven to build things. And I think that resonated with people and made them lean in and pay attention and care and show his perseverance and his passion for this idea. And then anchoring to this thing they discovered when they were starting to build their business and work on their idea about all of their customers and how their customers really struggled to compete and survive and offer kind of modern amenities in the age of Amazon coming onto their turf.
Anything that stands out in terms of a tough story that was hard for you to help somebody? Anything that stands out? And what was hard about it?
Yeah, I mean, there are stories that are really hard to tell because they are so specific, where there's like a macro circumstance that is just hard to contend with. Like, I can't reveal the name of the company, but I'll try to communicate it as clearly as I can. There's a company working in energy domain, fusion domain. So working on new fusion, and, number one, like, they're in the fusion space. So there's all the skepticism that anybody has about fusion and its timeframes and cost. There's also excitement, so that could play to their advantage, but there's certainly cynicism or some skepticism in that domain. There's no way it's not going to be capital intensive and very long duration. So that's hard to avoid. And then on top of that, the company had a key dependency risk where kind of a core component of their technology was provided by another company, another startup at that. And that becomes really difficult to manage from a storytelling standpoint and getting somebody's attention, because I think you have kind of compounded key risks that just factually hard to navigate around. And so not every company can have or will have a great story. And those are things that are just tough. And you need to find somebody that is really either a believer, or you need to choose to go a really hard road where you're up against some really big obstacles.
Zach, you obviously spent a lot of time in the venture world, investing and also helping founders tell stories. Say more about your own evolution as a storyteller and how you learned this art.
Well, I don't know if I've learned it, because I think it's endless learning. It's something that's truly an art form and not necessarily formulaic. And that's what makes it fun and hard and challenging. And I go back to my own experience, and it's kind of obvious when you look at it in hindsight, which is the things that capture the most attention are those that are rooted in story, not fact. It's why conspiracy theories are so effective. They're little stories that people like to tell. Stories really tap into something that make us deeply human. And since time immemorial, they're how we share ideas and coordinate action. And I mean, even if you look at the root of some of our most enduring human institutions like religion, they're all stories. It's books of stories. And so stories are obviously quite important. And this is why people enjoy reading novels more than textbooks. So there's something very human about stories. And I came to appreciate this both kind of observationally thinking about these things, but also paying attention to the pitches that really resonated with me and to my team. And it was just tangible when somebody was an effective storyteller. They were much better able to capture attention and communicate ideas.
Yeah, I read it somewhere. I don't know who said this, but those who control the narrative control the world. I think Jim O'Shaughnessy keeps talking about it, O'Shaughnessy Ventures, and the American tabloid. I think it's all about the storytelling, right?
Stories are ideas, and ideas change the world, without a doubt. It's about belief and changing people's beliefs. And if you can do that effectively, you have a much higher chance of success.
Indeed, indeed. Are there any topics that we haven't covered that you believe should be talked about when it comes to storytelling or narrative development?
Just a high level takeaway is that a lot of people know this is important, but don't invest the time or the energy to really make it something that is important for them. Like, they know it's important, but they don't make it a priority. And I do think it has to be something that needs to be a priority if you really want to be successful as a founder, because even if you think about your roles and what you're trying to achieve in the world, like, you are starting out with almost nothing. You're just this insignificant single person with an idea. And to be successful, you need to attract a lot of resources. You need to be able to go out and get capital to fund this idea, to hire people, to buy equipment, to lease facilities. You need to convince a whole bunch of other people, not just to give you money, but to come actually work with you and for you, because they believe this is worthwhile, not because they're going to get a paycheck and join this risky thing, but because they believe this is something worth doing with their life versus all their other opportunities. You need to convince partners to do business deals with you and give you favorable terms. You need to convince the press to say nice things about you, talk about you. And all of those things all relate back to simply communications. Telling a story, helping somebody get excited about what you're working on. And it's not because of what you're working on, but because of why they should care. And that's really the most fundamental piece of it, which is figuring out how to make people interested in what you're doing in a way that's truthful, exciting, authentic.
Thank you. Thank you for that advice. And before we close this conversation, I want to talk about Series Z. Can you please talk about what Series Z does and how you work with founders?
Yeah, so Series Z is a pitch consultancy, is the simplest way I can describe it, that works very closely with a very small number of companies and funds to help them better tell their stories. And this is based on everything I observed over 15 years at Lux, and then the years since then that I've been working on this craft, really helping companies have an edge in the fundraising process. And I tend to like companies that are doing really big, important, meaningful things, because it's nice to feel like you can play a part in making a difference in the world. And the name is obviously inspired by the rounds of venture financings, which is everybody's heard of a Series A, B, C, D, but you've never heard of Series Z. So it's meant to be something that is immediately familiar, yet memorable.
All right. I'll have links to some of your videos that I saw on YouTube for others to watch. Zack, this has been very helpful. Like you said, storytelling it's never ending. You always learn. And thank you for helping us learn from one of the best in the field. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And good luck with everything.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.